Okay, hello guys. I stopped at the solutions part of transnational terrorism. So there are three measures to know. One is preventive, second one protective, third one responsive measures. Okay, this slide is absent from your handout. Okay, but it's important to differentiate between these three measures. Firstly, preventive measures are the measures to deter, to prevent terrorist attacks from happening in the first place. Okay, protective measures are measures to protect the country, the people, and key installations against terrorist attacks. Okay, responsive measures are the measures that enable the country to respond to any crisis or any terrorist attack should it happen. Okay, so um, even though we will want to deter and prevent terrorist attack from ever happening, but should it happen, we should also have the right kind of measures to cope with, to deal with the situation. So these are the responsive measures. Okay, so we begin with the preventive measures. Again, preventive measures have the aim of preventing, to deter, okay, terrorists and reduce a country's vulnerability to terrorist attacks. Okay, we can do it through three ways: border controls, collaborating with other countries, and through total defense. So border controls is quite simple. Okay, we have our border controls through our land, sea, and air checkpoints to prevent the entering the movement of foreign terrorists into Singapore and prevent them from bringing in materials they are likely to be able to use to make explosives, okay, to cause terrorist attacks in Singapore. And in the case of Singapore, the ICA is responsible for strengthening the security of our borders. For example, we use the biometric technology, the fingerprint technology, okay, to verify the identity of travelers, okay, into Singapore. We also have the radiographic image analysis of cargo vehicles, okay, to scan through the contents of what these cargo vehicles bring into Singapore to ensure that they are not bringing in harmful materials into Singapore that can threaten the safety and security of Singaporeans. Okay, so in other countries like the US, they have the no-fly list to restrict the air travel of suspected terrorists within, into, and out of the countries. So in the case of Americans who are not in the US, they are outside of the US, but who are placed on the no-fly list, they will not be allowed to board any plane to fly back into the US. Okay, then for the non-Americans who are in the US, okay, they are also not allowed to board any plane to fly back to their home countries if they were being put on the no-fly list. So this will ensure the safety and the security of the passengers on board the plane so that we do not have a repeat of the 911 incident where the terrorists hijack the planes, okay, and cause casualties and deaths to the passengers on board the plane as well as to the people, okay, who were in the targeted buildings which they crash into. Okay, so another way to prevent terrorist attacks is through collaboration among countries. Okay, so transnational terrorism is a form of terrorism that can take place in any country. So no country is spared, okay, from transnational terrorism. So it is best managed when all countries work together to share information, to share intelligence, to share resources and best practices on how to best counter terrorism as a whole. Okay, so the United Nations being the international body to safeguard world peace after the world wars. Okay, so United Nations is responsible for ensuring the safety security of regions worldwide. So they implemented this resolution 1373 after the September 11 attacks, which calls upon all member countries of the UN to share intelligence, to share information on terrorist groups and their activities, and to cooperate with one another to take action against terrorists. Because the last thing we want is for governments in other countries to protect these terrorists, to provide these terrorists with safe haven, or to provide terrorists with funding to enable them to further carry out their terrorist attacks. We do not want that to happen. So it calls upon all member countries to pledge their commitment, okay, to fight against transnational terrorism and not protect or to provide safe havens for these terrorist groups. Okay, in ASEAN, Singapore also works with other ASEAN countries to share best practices on how to manage transnational terrorism through this workshop called the ASEAN Counter-Terrorism Workshop. Okay. Next, we have the total defense in Singapore to involve everyone in the defense efforts of Singapore. So we have 5 pillars under total defense. We have military defense, civil defense, economic defense, social defense, and psychological defense. Take the example of social defense. Social defense is actually a responsibility that each and every one of us in Singapore bears. Okay, how is this so? Okay, social defense means that every individual in Singapore should make the effort to maintain harmony and social cohesion in Singapore amongst all races and religions. Okay, so that terrorists cannot use the multi-ethnic nature of the Singapore society to play one race against another. So take the example of the JI planned attacks in Singapore. The JI group actually planned to attack Singapore. For instance, they wanted to attack the MOE building, Changi Airport, in Singapore, but they failed. But in the case of the JI, when they were arrested, they claimed that they were acting in line with Islamic teachings. Therefore, this actually caused suspicions towards the Muslim community in Singapore when the JI terrorists were arrested. And we do not want that to happen. This shows how easily terrorists can make use of religious differences, to create mistrust, tension amongst different racial groups, and to cause internal political instability, to cause internal social and political instability in Singapore. And when Singapore is that vulnerable, when there is internal instability in Singapore, the terrorists will then make use of this internal instability to launch an attack to completely cripple Singapore as a country. So we do not want terrorists to expose and take advantage of the racial differences or religious differences in Singapore and use it to their advantage, to cripple and topple Singapore as a country. So it is actually each and everyone's efforts to safeguard the social harmony and social cohesion in Singapore, to keep our social fabric intact, so that we are resilient, we are united as a country to fight against terrorism. We do not let them expose our vulnerabilities, and use it to their advantage. So with total defense involving everyone in the defense efforts of Singapore, it will strengthen the people's resilience as a nation, such that terrorists will think twice about attacking Singapore if they know that they face the entire nation and not just the military forces. So in a way, it will help to deter and ward off terrorist threats from Singapore to safeguard our national security. Okay? So we are done with preventive measures. Let's move on to protective measures. As a recap, protective measures are measures to protect the citizens and the key installations in Singapore from terrorist attacks. So we have 2 ways that we protect Singapore from these threats. The first one, surveillance. Second one, to detain terrorist suspects. So under surveillance, it is the Singapore Armed Forces protecting our borders by working closely with other homeland agencies to protect key installations in Singapore. Key installations can be Changi Airport. It can also be the Jurong Island, which are targets for the terrorists, because terrorists have this aim in mind to inflict mass damage, mass casualties, and mass deaths. So they will want to target strategic spots in Singapore, which when they launch an attack, it will bound to create mass casualties, mass damage. So in this case study, we are talking about Jurong Island, which is the petrochemical hub in Singapore, where the oil and gas companies like Shell, BP, and ExxonMobil, they have the oil refineries here in Jurong Island, and each day it processes a lot of crude oil, turning it into petrol, kerosene, and jet fuel to be sold locally and overseas. So with all these oil and gas production and refining processes taking place in Jurong Island, imagine if there is a bomb blast, the damage can be very big and very severe. So that's why it's very important to safeguard these key installations from any potential terrorist harm and threats. Okay, so the SAF actually works closely with the Singapore Police Force and Police Coast Guard to guard the sea and land access to Jurong Island. The Navy also works closely with the Police Coast Guard to guard the sea line of communication. Okay, and the Republic of the Singapore Air Force also safeguard our skies. Okay, so all these are efforts to protect key installations in Singapore from terrorist attacks. Okay. Next, we talk about detaining terrorist suspects as a form of protective measure. So Singapore, we have this Internal Security Act. Basically, this is a law. This is a form of law, 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 which allows the government to detain without trial, individuals who individuals who pose as a threat to Singapore's national security. Okay, such threats can be in the form of terrorist threats, racial and religious extremism threats which can tear a society apart, can damage social cohesion in Singapore. It can also be other forms of security threats. Okay, so this ISA gives the government the authority, the right to detain these kind of suspects, without going through any court trials or court proceedings. Okay, they can just detain them to remove these threats from the public, from the society, to ensure public order and public safety. Okay, so because we do not want terrorist suspects to be roaming the streets and causing potential harm in the next minute, so you want them to be kept away from the public so that they are unable to carry out their terrorist acts. Okay, so this is a way that the government protects the people from these terrorist suspects. Okay, so the example 2012, we detained the JI members who had undergone terrorist training in Afghanistan and who were actively involved in monitoring strategic points in Singapore to launch potential attacks in Singapore. So we remove these people, from the public, from the society, and detain them so that they are unable to cause any harm to the security of Singapore. Okay, and another example is this. This teen is actually arrested under the ISA, detained under the ISA because he intended to join ISIS. And also he researched on ways to make explosives, to assassinate, to kill government leaders, to target some spots in Singapore, to carry out attacks in the public using weapons such as knives even. So this is how the ISA is in place to remove these terrorists, to remove these self-radicalized individuals, in this case, these self-radicalized individuals from the public, so that they are unable to carry out any harm or any damage to the society as a whole. Lastly, we have the responsive measures, which is about being able and prepared to deal with the damages or harm should a terrorist attack happen in Singapore. So responsive measures, there are two aspects: responsive measures in Singapore and how we actually collaborate with other countries, to respond to attacks or respond to crises in other countries. In Singapore, the Singapore Police Force and the Singapore Civil Defence Force, they have emergency preparedness exercises, to test their contingency plans, in the case of if a terrorist attack were to break out, were to happen in Singapore, how do these agencies respond to these attacks? So we have exercises, emergency preparedness exercises, such as the exercise Heartbeat, which are held annually, where the home team agencies will work with the community and private corporations. So exercise Heartbeat is actually smaller in scale because the SPF, the Singapore Police Force, or the Singapore Civil Defence Force, they may collaborate with private companies or private organisations, or even work with shopping centres like Jurong Point Shopping Centre, to test out how they will respond should a terrorist attack happen in a shopping centre. So that's exercise Heartbeat. Exercise North Star is actually testing the whole of the government ability to respond to emergency scenarios, to raise public awareness on the threat of terrorism, and to emphasize the need for continued public vigilance. So exercise North Star actually pulls together various government agencies like the SPF, the SAF, the SCDF, okay, to test how different agencies are able to coordinate and synchronize their responses in the case of a terrorist attack. Okay, because we do not want to be in a situation when terrorists attack in Singapore and all the agencies suddenly they do not know how to respond, they do not know how to communicate effectively with one another to deal with the threat. So it's important to test out the contingency plans so that we can ensure better coordination amongst the different agencies to better cope with a terrorist attack. Okay, and Singapore also collaborates with other countries to improve its capabilities to respond to transnational terrorist threats. Okay, in the case of Singapore, we work closely with other countries like USA, France, and Sweden, okay, to improve our research and development efforts on how to safeguard ourselves from chemical, biological, radiological, and explosive related attacks. Okay, we also participate in exercises with other countries to exchange information on how to deal with chemical, biological, radiological, and explosive, otherwise known as CBRE in short, okay, related terrorist attacks. Okay, so you can read here the example of how we have the ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting plus counter-terrorism exercise, okay, where countries came together to discuss strategies on how to deal with CBRE-related terrorist attacks. Okay, because these are CBRE attacks can be such that terrorists release lethal, fatal, okay, gases, chemical gases into just a public space, and then everyone inhales the chemical gas and get poisoned, okay, and die as a result. So it may be possible, this kind of different tricks that the terrorists, the tactics that terrorists use, we have to be prepared against this variety in terrorist threats, okay. So, an example of a chemical attack that happened in Japan was the 1995 Tokyo subway sarin attack. So basically, there was this group of religious cult members. They dropped 5 plastic bags of liquid sarin on MRT trains, okay, during the rush hour of Japan, and when the when the liquid sarin was dropped, okay, on these subway trains, okay, actually passengers who came out from the MRT trains, they inhale this sarin gas. It is a nerve gas. They actually collapsed on the platforms. It resulted in various complications as a result of inhaling. Okay, some of them, I think they possibly died from this chemical gas attack. So you can see chemical gas attack related to the CBRE attack, one of the CBRE attacks, it can inflict mass casualties and mass deaths as well. Okay, just like how we have a suicide bomber rushing into a crowd and exploding himself, okay, and causing people to die in a few seconds, chemical attack also has the same kind of potential to cause mass casualty and mass deaths. Okay, so if you have a SRQ Part A question that asks for strategies to combat transnational terrorism, okay, I found this online. I came across this, not really found, I chanced upon this online, okay, and I find it that this is quite an interesting strategy, is that the government can maintain a web portal to encourage the reporting of online websites and materials, okay, that propagate or promote terrorism and extremism, so that we do not have the case of people coming into contact with this online propaganda on terrorism and believing them and carrying out terror attacks on their own accord. Okay, just like the self-radicalized individuals, okay, that we have talked about in class about who was that, the Oslo, okay, the person, the self-radicalized individual who actually went to cause a bomb blast in Oslo and also went to a youth camp and started shooting at the teenagers in the youth camp. Okay, this is an example of a self-radicalized individual. Okay, why? Because he read about all these materials propagating terrorism online, and he himself turned into a terrorist. Okay, even without being affiliated to any terrorist groups. So we want to minimize the incidences of self-radicalization in Singapore. We can propose for government to maintain this web portal for people to report, okay, any online websites that they chance upon that are actually propagating all these terrorism materials, okay, and terrorism ideals. So this is it for the solutions, okay, for transnational terrorism.